Missouri River breaks, Montana Territory, August 1886. The sun was a hammer on an anvil of baked earth. The cottonwoods along the river hung limp and gray with dust. In the new settlement, a cluster of raw log cabins and hopeful little plots, the sound of construction was the sound of axes and saws, of wood being forced to man's will. But on Jan Kral's claim, the sound was different. It was the rhythmic scrape and thud of a spade biting into the high, sheer bluff that overlooked the water. Jan wasn't building up. He was digging in. Darius Holt, the man who had overseen the construction of nearly every proper cabin in the settlement, stood with his arms crossed, watching the Bohemian work. Holt was a builder, a man who understood the logic of post and beam, of notched logs and pitched roofs. What he was seeing made no sense. Kral was carving a rectangular cavern directly into the face of the 30-foot bank of packed loam. "He's digging his own family's grave," Holt said, not to anyone in particular, but Silas Croft and Abel Finch, who stood nearby, nodded in solemn agreement. Croft, a farmer whose knuckles were permanently skinned from wrestling this unforgiving land, squinted at the growing cavity. "It's mad. Kral's folly, that's what it is." Holt shook his head, a professional's pity mixing with irritation. He walked closer, close enough for his voice to carry over the scrape of Jan's shovel. "Kral, that bank is packed loam, not stone. It holds its shape in the dry. But you know what our spring rains are like? First good soak, it'll slump. First hard freeze, it'll heave right into your living space. You're putting your wife and children in a trap." Jan Kral stopped his work. He was not a large man, but his shoulders and back were thick from a lifetime of heavy, deliberate labor. He leaned on his spade, wiped sweat from his brow with the back of a dirty forearm, and looked at Holt. His blue eyes were calm. "The earth is strong, Mr. Holt," he said, his English thick with the cadence of his homeland. He then turned and drove the spade back into the wall of dirt. The conversation, as far as he was concerned, was over. Holt watched for another minute, then turned away in disgust. The man was a fool, and there was no curing that. What did this Bohemian cellar mason, this quiet immigrant with dirt under his nails, understand about thermal mass that a professional frontier builder, a man who had raised a dozen sturdy cabins against the Montana wind, had missed? This is a story about a different kind of wisdom. Not the wisdom of conquering the frontier, but of understanding it. If you stay with us, I promise you will learn the simple, powerful physics of why the earth itself is the greatest insulator man has ever known, a principle that modern architects are only now rediscovering. We're fascinated by stories of forgotten genius. Let us know in the comments, have you ever seen a house built directly into a hillside? And did you ever wonder how it worked? Your engagement helps us bring more of these histories to light, so be sure to subscribe and hit the like button if you believe, as we do, that the past has lessons worth learning. Jan Kral was not a carpenter. He had none of Darius Holt's practiced skill with a broadaxe or a saw. He was not a farmer like Silas Croft, attuned to the subtleties of sun and seed. He was a sklepnik, a cellar mason from the rolling hills of Bohemia, a land where every respectable farmstead had its deep, cool cellar cut into the earth. His hands were not familiar with the grain of wood, but with the texture of soil. He knew the difference between clay that would hold water and loam that would breathe. The tools of his trade were not saws and planes, but tamping mauls, heavy spades with sharpened edges, and long plumb bobs for ensuring a perfectly vertical cut in a wall of compacted earth. He had spent his life underground, shaping spaces that had one purpose: to defy the seasons. He built cellars for storing potatoes and apples, cool chambers for fermenting beer, and deep, silent vaults for aging wine. These were places that had to remain cool through the hottest summer and stayed just above freezing in the bitterest winter, using nothing but the ancient, stable temperature of the ground itself. He had come to America with his wife Agnieszka and their two small children, Jakub and Zuzana, drawn by the promise of land. But their first winter, the winter of 1885, had nearly broken them. They had lived in a hastily built lean-to, a structure Holt had charitably called a starter cabin. It was a textbook example of conventional frontier building at its most basic, and it was a miserable failure. Jan remembered that winter not as a season, but as a collection of sensory tortures. He remembered the way the floor near the door would be glazed with a thin sheet of ice every single dawn, a treacherous welcome to the day. He remembered the smoke from the inefficient stove, which refused to draw properly in the dense cold air, and instead hung low in the single room, making the children cough through the night. Most of all, he remembered the water. Every morning, he would reach for the water skin hanging by the door only to find it frozen stiff, a useless block of ice. They survived, but barely. They burned a staggering amount of wood just to stay alive, a constant, exhausting battle of feeding the stove only to feel the heat vanish through the chinked log walls as if it had never been. One morning in February, after a particularly brutal night, Agnieszka had looked at him, her face pale in the smoky gloom. She wasn't complaining, she simply stated a fact. Jan, the children cannot have another winter like this. Her trust in him was absolute, but the fact remained. He had looked at the thin log walls, at the frost feathering the inside of the single window pane, and he knew she was right. He had tried to build like a frontiersman, and he had failed. So that spring, he would not build like a frontiersman. He would build like a sklepnik. He would build what he knew. The failure of that first cabin wasn't due to poor construction, not really. It was built as well as any other lean-to on the plains. The problem was more fundamental. The problem was physics. Specifically, the catastrophic failure of low-mass structures in an environment of extreme temperature fluctuation. A standard log cabin, even one built by a master like Darius Holt, is a thermal lightweight. Wood is a relatively poor insulator, but more importantly, it has very little thermal mass. This means it cannot store significant amounts of heat. When the fire roars, the air in the cabin gets warm quickly. When the fire dies down, the cabin gets cold just as fast. The structure is entirely dependent on a constant, massive input of energy, the burning of wood, to fight the outside cold. In a place like the Missouri River breaks, this was a recipe for misery. The Montana climate dealt in extremes. A sunny winter afternoon might reach 20 degrees Fahrenheit, but the moment the sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature would plummet to 20 or 30 below zero. The log walls of a cabin like Silas Croft's would track this plunge almost perfectly. The wood, having stored little of the day's heat, would rapidly cool, becoming a source of cold itself, radiating chill into the room. Croft burned through an immense pile of cottonwood each winter, a stack of logs as large as his cabin itself. His life was a cycle of cutting, splitting, hauling, and burning, all for a home that was never truly warm. The family lived in a small bubble of warmth a few feet from the cast-iron stove, while the corners of the room remained frigid enough to store meat. Every crack between the logs, no matter how well chinked with mud and moss, became a tiny dagger of incoming cold, driven by the ceaseless prairie wind. The settlers were fighting a war of attrition against the cold, and the fuel was their own physical labor. Jan Kral understood this in his bones. In Bohemia, the old stone and earth farmhouses were the opposite. They were thermal heavyweights. They took a long time to warm up, but once warm, they stayed warm for a long time. They acted like batteries for heat. Jan watched his neighbors fight the winter, and he saw their mistake clearly. They were building walls to keep the cold out. He was going to build a shelter that drew its warmth from the one place the winter could never touch, the deep, constant heart of the earth. In August, when the ground was dry and workable, Jan began his project. He didn't start by felling trees for walls. He started by choosing his location. He walked the length of his claim along the river until he found the perfect spot, a tall south-facing bluff of compacted glacial loam. South-facing, to catch the low arc of the winter sun. The bluff itself would be his northern wall, an impenetrable barrier against the prevailing winter winds. His first task was to carve the footprint of his home into the bank. With a heavy mattock and a sharp spade, he began to dig. It was brutal, painstaking work. He was not merely excavating a hole. He was sculpting a room. He marked out a rectangle, 18 feet wide and 12 feet deep. For days, the only sounds were the scrape of his shovel and the grunt of his effort as he hauled basket after basket of soil away from the site. The neighbors watched, shaking their heads. He used a technique he'd learned as an apprentice mason. After every few inches of depth, he would use a heavy wooden tamper to compact the floor, making it hard and stable. The walls were his masterpiece. He did not slope them. He cut them perfectly vertical, a sheer face of earth. He used his plumb bob constantly, ensuring the cut was true. Darius Holt saw this and scoffed. Any builder knew you couldn't leave a vertical dirt wall unsupported. It defied common sense, but Jan knew this soil. It was loam, mixed with just enough clay to bind it. Kept dry, it was as stable as soft rock. He knew its angle of repose wasn't a gentle slope, but a sheer cliff. Once the three-sided room was carved from the earth, he began to work with wood. This was the only part of the cabin that resembled a conventional structure. He used the stoutest cottonwood logs he could find to frame a front wall, with a single sturdy door and one large south-facing window to capture the winter light. The top plate of this log wall was his foundation for the roof. He laid heavy log rafters stretching from that front wall back to the top of the bluff, where they rested on a massive sill log he had carefully embedded and anchored deep into the soil. The roof itself was a thick layer of sod, laid over planks. From the front, it looked almost like a normal, if crude, cabin. From the sides or the back, it was invisible. It was simply part of the hill. Darius Holt made one last visit during the construction. He walked around the structure, his professional eye taking in every detail. He kicked at the base of the framed front wall. Then he walked to the side, where the wooden roof met the raw earth of the bluff. "You have no foundation under these side walls, Crawl," he stated, his voice flat with authority. "There's nothing to stop the frost from getting underneath this whole bank and heaving it upwards. I've seen it lift boulders the size of a horse. It will snap your roof timbers like twigs." He pointed a thick finger at the sheer dirt wall. "And when the spring melt comes, all the water from this entire hill is going to soak down. That loam will turn to mud. Hydrostatic pressure will build up until this whole wall gives way. It will slide right into your living space and bury your family while they sleep. It's not a question of if, but when." Jan listened patiently. He pointed up at the wide overhang of his sod roof, which extended a full 3 feet out from the earthen walls. "The roof keeps the wall dry, Mr. Holt," he said simply. "Dry earth does not move." He returned to fitting the door into its frame. For Holt, it was the final proof of the man's stubborn foolishness. He had tried to warn him. Now nature would have to teach the lesson. The secret to Jan Kral's strange structure wasn't magic. It was a profound, practical understanding of a single concept: thermal mass. Thermal mass is the ability of a material to absorb, store, and then slowly release heat energy. Think of a thin piece of sheet metal and a heavy cast iron skillet. If you put them both over a flame, the sheet metal heats up almost instantly. It has low thermal mass. The cast iron skillet takes a long time to get hot, but once it is, it stays hot for a long time after the flame is removed. It has high thermal mass. Darius Holt's log cabins were like the sheet metal. Jan Kral's bluff-cut shelter was the cast iron skillet. A standard 8-inch thick log wall has an R value, a measure of insulation, of about 8. Not terrible, but not great. More importantly, its mass is relatively low. The heat from the stove warms the air inside, but the walls themselves store very little of that energy. The wind outside constantly strips this heat away through the wood and through every tiny crack. The cabin is in a constant state of thermal panic, demanding more and more fuel. Now consider Jan's design. 3 of his walls were not wood. They were the planet Earth. A cubic foot of packed earth weighs around 100 pounds, while a cubic foot of pine weighs about 25. This density gives Earth an enormous capacity to store heat. But the true genius was in tapping the Earth's stable temperature. A few feet below the surface, the ground in Montana maintains a near constant temperature of around 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit all year long. It doesn't matter if the air outside is 100 degrees in August or 40 below in January. That deep earth temperature is a constant. It's a thermal flywheel. Jan's cabin was, in essence, a small cave with a window. The immense thermal mass of the surrounding earth was constantly trying to bring the temperature of his home to 55 degrees. In the dead of winter, this was a staggering advantage. His small stove wasn't fighting to raise the air temperature from minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit to a livable 65 degrees Fahrenheit, a difference of 105 degrees. It only had to raise the temperature from the Earth's baseline of 55 degrees Fahrenheit to 65 degrees Fahrenheit, a difference of just 10 degrees. The energy savings, measured in BTUS, was astronomical. The Earth itself was doing 90% of the work. As for Holt's legitimate concerns about collapse, Jan's bohemian training had provided the answers. He knew that the danger wasn't the weight of the earth, but the power of water. Water, when it freezes, expands with incredible force, causing the frost heave that Holt feared. Water lubricates soil particles, causing the slumping and slides Holt predicted. Jan's entire design was a water management system. The wide roof overhang kept rain and snow melt away from the vertical walls, ensuring the load-bearing loam stayed dry and stable. The slight slope of the land above his cut directed surface runoff away from the structure. He hadn't just dug a hole, he had integrated his home into the hill's natural hydrology. He wasn't fighting the earth, he was borrowing its immense quiet strength. The autumn was short and sharp. The cottonwood leaves turned a brilliant, fleeting yellow and were gone in a single windy week. By November, the ground was frozen hard, and the first snows dusted the brown hills. In the conventional cabins of the settlement, the annual battle began. The stacks of firewood began to shrink. The sound of axes splitting logs became a daily chorus. Inside the bluff-cut shelter, a different reality was taking shape. Jan had installed a small, efficient cast-iron stove against the front wall, venting it safely through the roof. He found he needed only a small fire, burning low and steady, to keep the single room comfortable. The air was still. There were no drafts because 3 of the walls were seamless earth. The silence was the most remarkable thing. The endless Montana wind, which had tormented them the previous winter, was now inaudible. The bluff took its full force, leaving their home in a pocket of profound calm. In January, the real test came. A plains blizzard, born in the Arctic, swept down across the territory. It was not a simple snowstorm, it was a liquid-driven fury. The temperature plummeted to 30 below zero, then 40. The wind howled at over 50 miles an hour, picking up the newly fallen snow and turning the world into a churning, horizontal chaos. Visibility dropped to less than 10 feet. It was a whiteout, a storm that erased the very concept of landscape. For 2 days, the world ceased to exist. Inside Silas Croft's cabin, life had shrunk to a space of 6 square feet around the stove. The fire roared, consuming logs at an alarming rate, but the heat felt thin and temporary. The wind found every imperfection in the chinking, driving icy tendrils of air across the floor. His wife and children were wrapped in every blanket they owned, their breath fogging in the air. The walls themselves seemed to radiate a deep, penetrating cold. They were surviving, but it was a grim, huddled existence. 20 yards away, buried in the bluff, the Krall family lived in a different world. The small stove glowed with a gentle warmth. The air was still and quiet, the roar of the blizzard reduced to a distant, muffled hum. The earthen walls, cool to the touch, were not stealing warmth but contributing a steady, neutral presence. They were radiating their constant 55-degree temperature, turning the room into a stable, thermal cocoon. Anishka, able to move freely about the room in a simple woolen dress, was kneading dough on their small table. The scent of yeast and wood smoke filled the air. Jakob and Zuzana, their children, were on a blanket on the floor, playing a quiet game with carved wooden animals. There was no ice on the floor. The water skin hung by the door, and its contents remained liquid. They were not just surviving the storm. They were living comfortably through it, their lives almost entirely undisturbed. The blizzard was a spectacle happening somewhere else, beyond the calm of their earthen walls. On the morning of the 3rd day, the wind died. The silence that followed was as absolute as the noise had been. The sun rose on a world transformed, buried under 4 feet of pure white snow, sculpted by the wind into massive drifts and waves. Darius Holt was one of the first to emerge. His cabin was half buried. The snow drifted up to the eaves on the north side. His first concern was his heavy wagon, which he had left near his woodpile, loaded with expensive saws and tools. He took a shovel and began to dig, the work brutal in the biting, minus 20-degree air. The snow was packed hard as cement. It took him over an hour of furious labor to clear a path and begin uncovering the wagon. As he worked, breathing hard, he paused to look out over the settlement. It was barely recognizable. The cabins were just white mounds, identifiable only by the thin plumes of gray smoke rising from their snow-choked chimneys. Then his eyes traveled down the river bend toward Krall's Folly. He expected to see nothing, to see the bluff completely buried in a monumental drift. What he saw stopped him cold. It was impossible. The wind, roaring over the top of the river bluff, had acted like a natural snowplow. The sheer face of the bluff was scoured almost completely bare, the brown earth a stark contrast to the white world. And at the base of the bluff, where Jan Krall's cabin front should have been buried under a 20-foot drift, there was a perfect, clean line. Holt dropped his shovel and began to walk, wading through the deep snow. As he got closer, the impossibility grew sharper. The snowdrift, which towered over everything else, simply stopped. It ended in a vertical wall of white about 5 feet from Krall's front door. In the space between the snowdrift and the cabin's log wall, the ground was nearly bare, a tiny, almost imperceptible amount of heat leaking from the front wall, and the sod roof had created a microclimate. The snow had not accumulated there. It had melted or sublimated, leaving a narrow, protected perimeter of dry, frozen ground. The cabin had not been buried by the storm. The earth it was built into had shrugged the storm off completely. He stood there staring, the cold forgotten. The physical evidence was undeniable, a clear refutation of everything he thought he knew about building. He saw the logic of it in a single, gut-wrenching flash. The cabin hadn't fought the blizzard. It had hidden from it. Just then, the cabin door opened, and Jan Krall stepped out, carrying a bucket. He looked up and saw Holt standing there. He offered a simple nod. He started towards his small, half-buried woodshed to get more fuel for the stove. Holt's voice was hoarse, full of a respect that bordered on awe. It wasn't an apology. It was a question from one craftsman to another. Jan, how? Jan paused and looked back at the bluff, then at his simple home. The ground is still, he said, so the warmth stays still. Holt looked from the massive, inert bluff to the tiny, warm cabin nestled at its feet. He finally understood the relationship between them. He shook his head, a slow smile spreading across his wind-burned face. He had found the words for what he was seeing. "You didn't build a cabin kraal," he said, his voice quiet. "You built a harbor." Darius Holt, the community's most respected and conventional builder, became the Bluff Cut Shelter's most powerful advocate. The story of the Kraal family's comfortable winter, and the visual proof of the cabin shrugging off the great blizzard, was too compelling to ignore. Holt did not simply praise Jan's work, he studied it. He asked Jan questions, not about carpentry, but about soil, about water, about the way the earth holds its temperature. He, the master of wood, became a student of dirt. The idea's first real test beyond Jan's claim came from the river itself. The Missouri was a working river, and crews of woodhawks, men who cut firewood for the passing steamboats, often had to winter over in rough, temporary camps along its banks. Their shelters were notoriously cold and miserable. That spring, Holt, having secured a contract to build a new trading post, hired a crew of these men. Instead of building them a standard wooden bunkhouse, he, with Jan's quiet consultation, showed them how to dig a series of small, two-man bluff-cut shelters into a long, stable bank near the work site. The river crews were skeptical at first, but they were practical men. The shelters were fast to build, requiring minimal lumber, only enough for a front wall and a simple roof. When the next winter came, the results spoke for themselves. The crews were warmer than they had ever been. They burned a fraction of the wood they normally would, saving them immense labor. The word spread up and down the river. The technique, now known colloquially as a kraal cellar or a Holt dugout, began to appear all along the Missouri breaks. By the winter of 1888, more than a dozen such structures had been built, providing safe, warm shelter for trappers, woodcutters, and new families just starting out. It was a piece of old-world knowledge, perfectly suited to this new, harsh landscape, spreading not through books or plans, but through practical, undeniable demonstration. What Jan Kraal built on that Montana bluff was a century ahead of its time. His intuitive understanding of the Earth's thermal properties anticipated the core principles of what we now call sustainable architecture and passive design. Modern Earth-sheltered homes use the exact same concept, leveraging the planet's stable subterranean temperature to dramatically reduce the energy required for heating and cooling. Architects and engineers today use complex software to model heat transfer, soil mechanics, and solar gain, all to achieve the same result that Jan accomplished with a spade, a plumb line, and the inherited wisdom of his trade. He had no knowledge of BTUS or R values, but he knew the feel of a dry, stable cellar wall, and he knew that the ground that stays still is the warmest place to be when the world outside is in chaos. The frontier is often imagined as a place of violent action, of conquering the wilderness, of imposing human will upon an untamed landscape. Men like Darius Holt embodied that ideal, building structures that stood upon the land, facing the wind and the cold like a fortress. But Jan Kraal's wisdom was of a different, quieter kind. It was not about opposition, but about integration. It was not about conquering, but about yielding to a greater strength. He saw the mighty bluff, not as an obstacle to be cleared, but as an ally to be embraced. The ground that stays still keeps warmth still. In a world that valued motion, expansion, and relentless progress, he found safety and comfort by choosing to be motionless. His home wasn't a testament to his fight against the winter. It was a testament to his partnership with the earth, a silent acknowledgement that the greatest source of shelter is not what you can build, but what you can join. The stillness of the soil became the stillness and security of his home. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the past. If you found this story of ingenuity and quiet wisdom valuable, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more tales of forgotten history. Every subscription helps us continue this work. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What other old world building techniques have you seen that seem strange at first, but are secretly brilliant? Your insights enrich our community. The video you have just watched presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, while the techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices. The application of any building techniques in a modern context should be done in accordance with current building codes, safety guidelines, and local regulations. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.